Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. John, thanks very much for the introduction. It's really exciting to be here so close to work, right across the way, speaking at the 8 Bells lecture series. I should say that if you take a look at the image of the cover of my book, you might be forgiven if you ask yourself, what does this have to do with maritime strategy? If you were going to judge a book or even a talk by its cover, you might take a look at this, and if you can see that map vaguely in the background, you'd think, okay, there are a couple of oceans there vaguely, but this is probably a book and a talk about the strategy of continental expansion, not maritime. So before I even get into the book, I thought it would be appropriate to establish my Navy bona fides. I'm a professor at the Naval War College. More appropriately, though, perhaps I probably have to establish John Quincy Adams's naval bona fides. So let's go to the beginning. John Quincy Adams started as a naval strategist. This image that you see here is a sketch on the last page of his diary in 1780 when he was 12 years old. And if you can't see what it says, the top is a British battleship, the Frightful. It's got 10 6-pound guns. On the bottom, smaller but no less frightening, is the Horrid, which only has 8 6-pound guns. Now, these are imaginary warships, the Frightful and the Horrid. But these are not really the works of a creative 12-year-old's imagination. In fact, he drew both of these while he was on a ship across the North Atlantic in the middle of winter, in the middle of a war, traveling with his father, who was the lead American diplomat during the American Revolution. And they had spotted quite a bunch of British ships. If these naval vessels had caught the American packet that was sailing them over, the results probably would have been pretty frightful and pretty horrid for him and his father. So as John Quincy Adams matured and grew older, the importance of a navy only expanded in his mind. He thought that for a rising nation, a navy was not a luxury, but in fact was a requirement for its security, for its commercial prosperity, and even for its own prestige. Here's another image with a couple more ships. There are also British ships in the background. And once again, things are working out somewhat frightfully and somewhat horribly for the United States. If you don't immediately recognize this image, it's the most famous image from the War of 1812. This is the shelling of Fort McHenry by the British. This is the source of our national anthem. It's not a particularly inspiring image. Our forts are being assailed and bombarded by the British. But John Quincy Adams thought, when he was serving abroad as a diplomat at this time, and wrote that this war might be instructive to ourselves. We might learn some lessons from this war if it will teach us to cherish the defensive strength of a respectable navy. Now, John Quincy Adams spent a lot of his career, a lot of his political capital, working on building up that respectable navy. So one final naval image for you. Any of you recognize this? Let me give you a hint for helping you out a little bit more. Now, does anyone recognize it? A little further south.
What's in Maryland that became the Naval?
Exactly. Okay. This is the U.S. Naval Academy, an early image of it. Now, John Quincy Adams did not found Annapolis. However, it wasn't found until 1845. But in 1825, in his first inaugural address, John Quincy Adams said that, and proposed to the Congress, the want of a naval school of instruction corresponding with West Point, we need it for the formation of a scientific and accomplished officer corps. He also proposed a massive shipbuilding expansion project. So now that I've established John Quincy Adams as a fledgling naval strategist at the age of 12, a maritime enthusiast, and the not quite founding father of Annapolis, I can move on to probably his most well-known role. He was the son of John Adams. Right now, many of my colleagues have heard me say this before. How many of you have read the David McCullough biography of John Adams or seen the HBO movie adaptation? Okay, that's most here, but not all. So I'll summarize for you. John Adams, not John Quincy, John Adams, was smart. He knew it. He wanted you to know it. And as you might have guessed, he was somewhat obnoxious about it. Well, in the Adams family, the apple did not fall very far from the tree. This is an image from that HBO series. And this was particularly true for John Quincy, the eldest son of John and Abigail Adams. Now, for those of you that saw the HBO film, if you remember anything about little Johnny, you'll remember that he was a dutiful son, an extremely bright young man, and an insufferable brat. But there are a couple of other things about John Quincy Adams that make him worth remembering. As I gave you that introduction with his sketches, he joined his father at the age of, before he was even a teenager, and sailed over to France and Holland in the midst of the American Revolution and got to witness American diplomacy and statecraft in its infancy. When he returned to the United States to attend Harvard College, he was probably the most well-traveled American of the entire era. He's appointed at the age of 27 years old to be ambassador to the Netherlands. And he goes on to have a rather distinguished diplomatic career under Presidents Washington, President Adams, that's his dad, and President Madison. He's then appointed Secretary of State under James Monroe and serves in that position for 8 full years and is generally credited with extending U.S. borders all the way to the Pacific for the first time. It's quite a list of accomplishments, and he follows that up with the low point of his entire career. He's elected President of the United States. Now, Quincy Adams actually does see the presidency as the low point of his career. It's not a particularly successful presidency, but the vision that he lays out as president of the executive branch and really of the entire federal government is probably the most expansive vision of government until FDR more than 100 years later. If that's not enough for you, Quincy Adams then goes back into politics as a congressman in Massachusetts, serving out the remainder of his days, that's 17 more years, as an increasingly vocal opponent of slavery. So John Quincy Adams' career is pretty impressive. Think about this. As a young man, he is educated with and sits around Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. As an adult, he shares the national stage with John Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. And as an old man, he sits, his final Congress, he's sitting in the first Congress that Abraham Lincoln sits in. When he goes abroad as a diplomat, he rubs shoulders with every famous person of the age, including Austria's Prince Metternich, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and even Napoleon Bonaparte. When famous people travel to the United States of America, they always seek out John Quincy Adams. That includes Alexis de Tocqueville, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Charles Dickens, and with good reason. Right? He, John Quincy Adams, is the author of the Monroe Doctrine. He has influenced Washington when he wrote the Farewell Address, and he even helped set the stage for Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. His career is so broad-ranging, it's so wide-ranging that you might think of Adams having something of a Forrest Gump-like effect on early American history. Right? With every famous person, with almost every significant issue in the Republic, Adams is there. And let me give you a couple of examples of this. The Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. Well, a little 7-year-old Johnny Adams climbs the hill in his backyard with his mom and watches the cannon fire going off. The Jay Treaty, one of the first and most important treaties in American history. Well, as a newly appointed diplomat, he sails across the Atlantic with the draft of the Jay Treaty, which he hands to Mr. Jay. The War of 1812, I've showed you this image before. Well, Quincy Adams is the lead negotiator on the resolution of this war, the Treaty of Ghent, which comes out of this. The Monroe Doctrine. It should be called the Adams Doctrine because he's the one that drafts all the language for the Monroe Doctrine. It keeps going. The gag rule, which you might remember, right? That the idea that slavery cannot even be discussed because it's too volatile of an issue in the House of Representatives. So they gag it, right? You can't discuss slavery. That's the general idea. but it's specifically geared towards John Quincy Adams, who keeps bringing petition after petition for the abolition of slavery to the floor of Congress. Finally, the Amistad trial. Some of you might have seen that terrific film with Anthony Hopkins portraying John Quincy Adams, where the Africans who were aboard the package ship, the Amistad, overthrow their captors, kill them, and then sue the U.S. government for their liberty. Well, it's John Quincy Adams who argues their case and wins their freedom at the Supreme Court. Again, Quincy Adams is everywhere. He's probably the most interesting and most influential American of the entire 19th century. Think about what he was capable of, what he did with his life. He was a political essayist. He was a diplomat. He was a politician. He was a professor. He was a poet. He was a lifelong advocate of science and technology. He was an avid amateur astronomer. He was a wine expert, and he was a really good gardener to boot. So I think at this point, you get my point. He's really interesting. He's famous. He's really important to understanding early American history. But there's another reason, I think, why it's critical that we think about John Quincy Adams, and when you think about American history, that make him not only important for understanding early American history, but in fact for thinking about America's place in the world today. And that's because I argue in my book that John Quincy Adams serves as the first grand strategist in American history. And it's his strategy that implicitly shapes the rise of the United States to continental, hemispheric, and ultimately global power. Now, I just said implicitly shapes the rise, and implicit is the key word here, because it's not like John Quincy Adams ever sat down and wrote out his worldview and his grand strategy in prose. That is not for lack of evidence. John Quincy Adams, as a historian, is a gold mine. The man produced hundreds of thousands of pages over the course of his life. I've given you some of the formal documents that he wrote over the course of his life, and if you can't see them in the back, let me read you what he wrote. Well, first of all, as a politician, he gave hundreds of public addresses. He gave speeches on the floor of Congress, one of which, when he was railing against slavery, went for 3 weeks straight. His correspondence is voluminous. He writes histories of the Turkish war that's going on. He writes letters to his sons about the Bible and its teaching. He has a scholarly presentation on Shakespeare and what it can offer us as strategic thinkers. He writes biographies of James Madison and Jonathan Monroe, starts one of his father, never completes it. Here's my favorite one. He even writes a 266 stanza four-canto poem about the 12th century conquest of Ireland by Henry II. And if that's not enough for you, that's only the beginning, because he keeps a diary from the day that he turns 12 until the day he literally drops dead on the floor of Congress. Every day, he sits down and writes in this diary. It runs to, I've given you some of the images there, almost 51 manuscript volumes, nearly 17,000 pages. And every day, he's writing down what he did, who he met, and what he thought about. And it's an exceptional window into what Adams thought he was doing and what he was trying to create. Now, here at the Naval War College, we impress upon the officers that we teach that before you can conduct any strategy, you have to understand what you are driving at, what you are trying to accomplish, right? And on this, Adams was crystal clear. The rise of the United States was destiny. Right? He thought that God, he uses the word all the time, had intended for the United States to become the most powerful and the most prosperous nation in the history of mankind. He also thought that it was destiny that the United States, as embodied by the principles in the Declaration of Independence, was going to be the first ideology that had a global reach. Destiny, however, is not a strategy, right? Destiny doesn't tell you what to do when, and John Quincy Adams is not a bad strategist, right? So from those destiny comments, I think you can understand that he has a pretty clear understanding that the objective, the mission of America is to preserve, protect, and expand the republic and the idea of republicanism. But that's not enough, right? You can't just have a vision. You have to understand what threats might get in the way of your vision actually happening, right? You have to have an understanding of what constraints might be imposed on us. We'd all like to have what we would like, but you have to understand how you are going to affect strategies to get there based on what threats you see there. So John Quincy Adams had a very keen understanding of the strategic environment in which he was dealing. These images, you might remember them from your grade school textbooks, right? These are rather benign, somewhat whitewashed images of American expansion westward across the continent. If you kind of look very carefully, here I was told to use this. Does my laser pointer work? No. Yes. Here you go. There are some Indians, some Native Americans. They look sad, but these are not paintings that tell you the story of American expansion from a native indigenous perspective. This is from an American perspective, and it is a decidedly optimistic point of view, right? All America had to do to expand across the continent was simply march westward, right? Well, there were some reasons to be mildly optimistic. There was a big ocean between Europe and the United States. The United States had enshrined the protection of individual liberties into its constitution, and it had a growing and commercially minded spirit. But having these ideas, having this aspiration of America as a great Republican entity did not make it so. Take again a look at the cover of my book. Perhaps you can't in the back see that image so well. This is the map that's in the background of my book. And if you can't read the title of this, let me read it for you. This is a 1774 map, and it says, North America as divided amongst the European powers. And then you have on this image the location of British, French, Spanish, and Russian interests on the North American continent, right? This is what America looked like to the Founding Fathers, right? Multiple European entities having territorial stakes and claims on the North American continent. So this is not the image that the founding generation had of America and the North American continent, right? All you got to do is expand westward. A better image for how they thought about the North American continent, a continent that was, as a republic, something that was going to be opposed by European monarchies that did not like the idea of republicanism and had territorial ambitions on the North American continent. This is a better image of how the American Founding Fathers thought of the North American continent, right? This is taken from 1804, William Pitt and Napoleon carving up the world and maybe North America. Here's another image that might have struck them as more true. The European monster thrusting himself across the Atlantic and challenging America, right? These are the external realities that the founding generation had to deal with. But this is only half of it, right? Because there were internal problems as well. And here I point to the issue of slavery and divisive internal domestic politics, which might actually threaten the growth of America. So we had an external problem at the beginning. We had some internal problems at the beginning, even if they didn't quite yet jeopardize the nation. But we also had what you might call a psychological problem at the beginning. Americans wanted to sprint before they knew how to crawl. Another way of saying this is Americans were so excited about the idea of Republican institution, Republican government, that they wanted to rush to the aid of anyone around the world who proclaimed themselves to be a Republican revolution before they had finished setting up their own one at home. Quincy Adams was very troubled by this because he thought that this missionary zeal that most Americans had outstripped the capabilities, the means that they had available to them, and that left the nation vulnerable. So if you think about these objectives, which I've talked about, right? Preserving, protecting, and expanding the American Republic and the idea of republicanism, in light of these threats, the strategy that Adams promotes in order for the United States to grow to a great power is threefold, I think. It is carving out space for physical security, national development, and morality. So let me spend just a little bit of time talking about each of these. First, physical security. This is that image again from the cover of my book, right? North America as divided amongst the European powers. Adams wanted to make sure that this did not happen, right? His strategy was to undermine the grip of, that Europe might have on the North American continent. Now, a lot of this he thought would happen pretty naturally, right? As the United States grew, it would naturally begin to push European powers out of North America. But it had to be very careful, because if it took actions that invited reprisal, that invited the European monarchies to expand their control here, that would be very dangerous for a young republic. So this was particularly true if you think of the context in which this is happening. The world is dominated by Anglo-French commercial and empire rivalry, right? And the United States, if it wants to stay neutral in this so it can keep trading and keep growing rich and say no to either London or Paris, needed to have the means, the capabilities to say no. And specifically, we're talking about having a navy, right? So Adams actually is a big proponent of building a navy as a defensive, a deterrent against the European powers. However, this is a great thought to have, but Adams knew Americans pretty well. And to have a navy, what do you have to do? You got to tax yourself. Americans do not like taxing themselves. They didn't like, I should say, they didn't like taxing themselves, because we like to now very much. And what Adams promoted was that absenting a national emergency, Americans were probably unlikely to tax themselves at a rate sufficient to build up a deterrent capability. So that's one thing that he promoted in terms of physical security. But remember, having a big navy is only a means to an end, right? And what's that end? It's the expansion across the North American continent. I love this image. This looks like it's supposed to be the great eagle of America stretching its wings across North. It looks like the great pigeon of American security stretching its wings. But you get the idea from this, right? And this can be seen, I think, most clearly when Adams serves as Secretary of State for 8 years, where he does really work to push French, British, and Russian interests out of, or nearly out of, North America, and does project American power almost all the way to the Pacific. Now, he does this, I think, quite nimbly, right? Because sometimes you have to use force, but sometimes you use diplomacy, and that depends who you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with Britain, which has the biggest navy in the world and is really emerged as very strong after the Napoleonic Wars, a little jaw before you war, as Winston Churchill said, a lot of diplomacy. If you're dealing, though, with the Spanish Empire, which still controls Florida and parts westward, and they're losing their grasp on power, well, the threat of military force, and sometimes the actual use of military force, might actually push them. So sometimes it makes sense to really use aggression. But projecting American power across the North American continent, Adams thought, actually required not only the use of aggression, but also the use of restraint. Right? So if you think about the time when he's Secretary of State, America is offered, that I use that verb loosely, the opportunity to help spread freedom and the idea of republicanism. Specifically, the Greeks are in rebellion against the oppressive rule of the Ottoman Turks. Most of South America has rebelled against the Spanish Empire, and they almost all send envoys to Washington, D.C. And they said, see, we read our Declaration of Independence. We want to do just what you did. And we need your help, and we need your men, and we need your financial backing, and we need your ships. And this is wildly popular in America and has broad support. And when it makes its way up to the cabinet for discussion, everyone says yes, except for John Quincy Adams. He says, no, this is not in our interest, and he ends up actually convincing the cabinet that's not. Now, why does he say this is not in American interest? What explains this restraint? I would argue that the same thing that explains his desire to expand across the North American continent. He wants to undermine European powers' hold on the North American continent. And if you give them an excuse to intervene, they'll take it. But it's more than that, I think, too. He also wants to be very clear, let us not divert our energies and resources from what we are trying to do, which is trying to set up a republic that functions well. And if you run around the world intervening, you are going to dilute the strength of what America can offer to the world. So what he ends up recommending is that America ought to restrain itself and focus its energies and resources at home. And this leads, I think, to his second great strategy, which is one of national development. National development with an idea to ensuring that American capabilities are set up for long-term economic growth. Right, and you can see this in the industries, and this is the University of Virginia, which is stood up right before he becomes president too. What Adams really wants to do is make sure that the country can grow over the long term, and what that means is investment. Investment in new industries, investment in infrastructure that will help create new markets. He advocates for federal subsidies for roads and canals that will help bring products to market and expand the markets that they have into the West, and also for investments in what we might today call human capital, for the growth of universities so that the Republic's citizens are as well trained, as thoughtful, and as entrepreneurial as they possibly can be. Well, what this means actually in policy practices, he advocates for the American system. And in broad stroke, there's three interrelated measures, right? A tariff that will protect American industries, a national bank that will help set up and fund new industries. That's one, two. I'm pulling a Rick Perry here. I'm glad someone got that. But then the third one is something else, which I'll return to in a second. But what he does is this idea of the American system, though, if you think about this, is he's advocating for a strong and interrelated and diverse American economy, right? One that's strong in agriculture, one that's strong in finance, and one that's strong in manufacture. And in fact, this is kind of the flip side of the coin of a strong foreign policy, right? A strong foreign policy is the flip side of a strong domestic economy, because if we are rich at home, we'll probably be more unified, and if we're rich and more unified, we can project our power even further. So this is what Adams advocates for, improvements. In fact, improvement, this idea of improvement, is the centerpiece of his presidency. During his first inaugural address, not the inaugural, during his first annual address to Congress, he mentions the word improvement 27 times. It's interesting because it more or less goes down in flames, and here's why. Because Adams doesn't just start with there, this is what we have to be improving on. He pushes this idea even further. He says that it's not only the government's business to promote industries and infrastructure, we have to create a positive vision of what a state can do. Right? If we're spreading this idea of republicanism, we have to show what it offers to citizens. So he begins to advocate for the educational and the moral improvement of the citizens as well. And it goes down in flames. And we could talk about that maybe a little bit more in Q&A for why that goes down in flames. But again, the vision that he sets out is the most progressive vision of the federal government until FDR. But you don't have to wait till FDR to see this in practice. Because in fact, it becomes really the centerpiece of the Whig Party and the centerpiece of the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln for how they're going to develop the country. Finally, morality. Right? From the beginning, Americans thought of their idea, they thought of their country as an idea and an ideology as much as it was a place. Right? And for this idea to be universally applicable, it had to be logically reasonable and morally compelling. Right? And that means bringing the promise of America in line with its practice. And that means eventually taking on slavery. Now, slavery is such a difficult issue in early American history because it is part of America. It's an institution woven into the very fabric of America's founding. It is in the Constitution, right? And yet is so fundamentally at odds with the country's own aspirations for itself. So figuring out that there's a real contradiction between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? And figuring out how to resolve that is, I think, the contradiction that was at the heart of the Republic that Adams spends the energies of his final years in Congress working on. Now, from the beginning, from 1804 onwards, Adams is saying somewhat publicly, mostly privately, that eventually abolishing slavery will set up the country on a much firmer foundation. but you can't do it too soon. Because if you attack slavery before the country is ready for it, you're inviting Europe in, right? It's easy to exploit. And so Adams, I argue that he decides, that he advocates for taking on slavery only once three things have happened. Once he thinks that the nation is strong enough to take on its own internal problems without inviting outside European powers to cannibalize it. And he thinks that's important because if you don't do so, you will retard that progress and that improvements that he has made the centerpiece of his presidency. And if you don't take it on, it will ultimately betray the mission of America as a Republican nation. So he does take this on as a congressman, and he does so in two big ways that set the stage, I think, for Abraham Lincoln later. The first of which is he advocates in public repeatedly for multiple years that the Constitution is not the founding document of the United States of America. The founding document is the Declaration of Independence. And you have to read the Constitution through the lens of the Declaration of Independence and give it the force of law, right? Because that tells you, ultimately, if you take the principles of the Declaration seriously, the direction that America ultimately has to move in, right? That is the Gettysburg Address, by the way. The second innovation that he makes, I think, it's not an innovation so much as a public series of charges and arguments that he makes, is only the federal government can do that. Right? Only the federal government can actually make that argument, and therefore state sovereignty needs to be subordinated to that federal entity. Well, this third element, morality, obviously is not resolved until the American Civil War, but it's the third component of the grand strategy that John Quincy Adams advocates, along with, again, physical security, national development, and morality. And if you view these three together, I think they go a long way to explaining the various stages of Adams's career that he moves through, the bridge between the Founding Fathers and Abraham Lincoln, and perhaps more importantly, the evolving strategy of the United States of America itself. I'm a historian, and so we have to turn to the only important question, which is, so what? Who cares, right? When Adams was Secretary of State, he famously proclaims in his July 4th, 1821 address, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Right? We can remain neutral on incidents around the world that we don't think immediately affect our interests. He also, when he's Secretary of State and living in Washington, D.C., hops into the Potomac River for a swim every morning with a pair of goggles on. That's it. The Secretary of State or even the President of the United States today does not have the luxury of either of those two today, right? I mean, circumstances are extremely different. I'm not just talking about skinny dipping in the Potomac, but really when American interests are worldwide, this is fundamentally a different context with which to judge revolutions as they break out. And yet, I think that Adams's grand strategy offers four broad lessons that are as applicable today as they were in the 1820s. So let me offer you my interpretation of this before you challenge me on all these. First, defining American power, using American power means being as conscious of its limits as of its reach. That means that defining American power as limitless somewhat paradoxically undercuts American power. Now, don't make a mistake here. John Quincy Adams was not shy about promoting American values, nor about employing military force when he thought it necessary, but he was very wary of overextending America, and throughout his career, he worked constantly to scale back what he thought were overbroad commitments to America. Second, the source of American power is domestic, right? And that's true in military, in economic, and even in moral terms. So as, or probably said, before America projects its power abroad, it needs to pay attention to all three of those elements of its own power. Third, regarding autocratic and tyrannical regimes, John Quincy Adams advocated change, but not upheaval. Right? He thought that upheaval was every bit as fraught and as full of danger as it was of promise. So the best type of change, whether or not America could influence this best type of change, was something that was slow and organic and emerged from societies and cultures themselves as opposed to the United States implementing it. And then fourth and finally, sequencing. Right? Think of this as the you can't have everything you want at once principle. Now, Quincy Adams was pretty clear, I think, about the stages that a growing power had to go through. Right? It had to protect itself from foreign attack. It had to enhance its own security capabilities. It had to work to bring its resources and capabilities to bear on itself to promote its own development. And then gradually it had to align its actions with its ideals. But some things were more important than others at certain stages. Right? Knowing which was which meant that he can not only prioritize but sequence. What made Quincy Adams, I think, a grand strategist, what continues to make him relevant, is that he understood the concept of grand strategy, of long-term strategy, which means having a vision, having priorities, and also being willing to make trade-offs as you went through. Now, you don't have to take my word on this. Here we have George F. Kennan, probably the most famous American grand strategist of the 20th century, and someone whom we were just teaching over in Strategy and Policy about this past week. And when he was writing in Foreign Affairs in 1995, I believe that makes him 93 years old at this point, this is what he had to say about Adams. This writer, for one, finds Adams' principle, albeit with certain adjustments to meet our present circumstances and commitments, entirely suitable and indeed greatly needed as a guide for American policy in the coming period. And if you don't want to take Kennan's word for it, take the current Secretary of State's word for it. When John Kerry was recently hosting the Chinese State Councilor Wang Jie trip, he was thinking, where can I bring him to impress him about American power and ideals? And he brought him to the Adams homestead up the road here in Quincy. And I think he got it exactly right, as you can tell by the overawed expression on Secretary Kerry's face. So at this point, let me stop, turn it over to you, and see what questions you might have about Quincy Adams. Sir.
I'm not sure, excuse me, I'm not sure of the timeline, but was there any cooperation or contact between him and Alfred Mahan during that time?
Not for him, maybe for Mahan. So Alfred Thayer Mahan doesn't really come into his own as a theorist, as a writer, until the 1890s, sadly for John Quincy Adams, because they both had great facial hair. He had been dead by that point about 50 years. But some of the concepts, some of the strategic writing, I'm sure Mahan came across himself. But they didn't overlap chronologically during their lives. Other questions? Sir?
I have asked you a million I could ask, but I want to ask
one, maybe two.
With two people, his mother and Thomas Jefferson.
Okay. Okay, so his relationship, right, I said that he had relationships with so many important people, so let's choose two of them. His mother and Thomas Jefferson. So think about the background that this young man had. He probably had the two most famous parents in American history, John and Abigail Adams. It's not the model of parenting that we have today. New England Puritanism. So let me give you a taste of it. John Adams, not Abigail, writes to his son, if you think about the advantages to which you were born to, it is incumbent upon you to rise to the top of your profession. Indeed, the top of your entire country, or you will have disgraced and disappointed me. That's actually not enough for Abigail. Abigail, right? It's very challenging because he sails over to Europe when he's 12, and he's there almost for 6-7 years before he even sees his mother, before she sails over as well. So, you know, teenagers aren't very good about staying in contact. He moves to Russia at one point, and they exchange a letter or so each year. But so, which means that as a young man, his mom doesn't really know him. But what she does want to impress upon him is the value of his morals. right? So in fact, she writes some charming letters to him, or they sound charming to us in the 21st century, that says, it is more important for you to keep up your morals when you go to that den of iniquity, Paris. Russia, actually Russia's not really a den of anything except a lot of snow. She says, you have to keep up your morals, and that's more important to me than anything else. And if you don't keep up your morals, it probably would have been better that your ship went to the bottom of the sea. Now, I'm painting, I think, one picture, but this is, I mean, this is kind of a norm, right, in Massachusetts, although the Adams are an extreme version of it to a certain extent. John Quincy Adams loves his parents. They set extremely high standards for him. His relationship is rather fraught with his mother. She nixes his first two girlfriends. She tries to nix his wife when he gets engaged. However, he's very smart. He gets engaged when he is in London and she is in Massachusetts. So he says, thanks, but no thanks, Mom. I'm marrying her. But he really does love his parents a lot. There's a funny little anecdote that when he dies in the House of Representatives, he's given a state funeral. They read passages, right? Of course, in the House of Representatives, the two passages that are read are a passage from the book of Job and one of his mother's letters to him, although probably not the one that I quoted to you. The second person you asked about was Thomas Jefferson. So I should say more broadly, the Jefferson and Adams relationship is a very complicated and tangled one, right? It's full of ups and downs, high ups and really low downs. And so John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, of course, start as great collaborators, right? Writing the Declaration of Independence together. Then as diplomats in Paris together during the American Revolution and thereafter. Right? And then Jefferson's in Paris while John Adams is in London. And they're really working together, although they begin to have very different thoughts about the role of the federal government. Right? And in fact, they are at the heads of two different parties. And of course, they reconcile in older age. So I've given you the nice story to make the point that when John Quincy Adams is a teenager, when he comes back from Russia, now I've said Russia a couple times, and this is worth mentioning, when he's 14 years old and he's in Europe with his father, when the American Revolution is underway, America says, you know what, we need more allies. What against Britain during the American Revolution? How about we open up an alliance with Russia? The Continental Congress says that's a great idea. Who do we have to send there? And they have an American politician who's serving as John Adams' secretary, a man named Francis Dana, and he says, well, I'll go. But I don't speak French, which is the language of the court of Catherine. So they say, well, who do we have available who speaks French, who's in Europe? How about the 14-year-old? So he actually becomes a diplomat at 14 and goes without his parents for 2.5 years to Russia, where there's basically no one his age and no one who speaks English. It's just, I mean, if you think about how his life plays itself out, it's just fascinating. When he comes back, his father now is negotiating the end of the American Revolution and the loans from the Dutch government, and Thomas Jefferson is actually right there. And Jefferson has just recently been widowed. He is living at a house nearby, and he is a great friend of the Adamses. So he starts at Abigail's really insistence, because she's there. He almost lives in their house. And by extension, when he's not living in their house, Quincy Adams is living with Jefferson himself and studying geometry with Jefferson. I've scoured the diaries for more references. I don't see that many or in the correspondence, other than the fact that after Jefferson and Adams have this great falling out, when they are older men deciding to reconcile themselves really for their place in history, when Quincy Adams is elected to the presidency, and of course John Adams is very proud, and he's in the midst of reconciling himself on those famous letters, he writes to Jefferson, John Adams, and says, look at my boy. And by the way, if you remember back, he's almost as much your son as he is mine, which is a nice coda to that, of course, before they both die on the same day, July 4th, 1826. Other questions? There was one in the back.
John Adams was elected president as a Federalist, and as I understand it, John Quincy Adams was elected as a Democrat-Republican. What were the sort of fundamental philosophical differences between the Federalists and what were then called the Republicans, and why did John Quincy Adams convert, for lack of a better term?
I believe the actual better term is jump ship.
Okay.
So a little bit of a distinction. There's the Federalist Party, to which John Adams is one of the founding members. He loses to Thomas Jefferson in the election of 1800. And then John Quincy Adams, in about 1808, becomes a Republican, soon to be known as the National Republicans. Now, there are two different points here. One is, why does he become, or start to become, a Republican and cross the aisle in 1808? And then why does he run on that ticket, and what does that ticket actually advocate? So 1808 is an interesting moment, right? He is actually doesn't really even consider himself a Federalist, although the Federalists appointed him to that office. And a little bit of background. So he comes home from his diplomatic missions, and he goes straight into politics, right? He's elected to the Massachusetts Assembly. And he proves to be an Adams, which means a really big pain in the butt. And so much of one that the rest of the Massachusetts legislature says, let's get rid of him, let's kick him upstairs and promote him to U.S. Senate and get him out of Massachusetts politics, and they do. And from the very first day that he's there, he works to antagonize his own popular base. So when he travels down to Washington, right, you can't take the Acela, you can't fly, you have to travel by coach, and it takes a long time. He shows up one day after the momentous vote on whether or not to approve the Louisiana Purchase has been cast. Now, if you are from New England, you are opposed to the Louisiana Purchase. Everyone from New England votes against it. And the reason they do is they look at where the country might expand to, they look at all the new offices, and it's going to undercut, so they determine Massachusetts' prime spot in American politics, or maybe co-equal spot with Virginia. It's seen as antithetical to New England interests, so they all vote against it. Now, if you're a smart politician, and you're John Quincy Adams, and you show up the day after the vote, what do? What should you do? Shut up. Instead, Quincy Adams gets on the floor and says, let me tell you why I would have voted for it, although I didn't have to vote for it, although how I would have modified it to make it in line with my principles. I would have proposed a couple of constitutional amendments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This gets the Federalists' hair up back in Washington, and he moves more so in that direction as his term as senator progresses. In fact, the major moment is a naval moment, right? As things heat up in Europe in the Napoleonic Wars, right, the Brits don't want the Americans trading with the French, right, aiding the enemy. The Americans say, hey, we're neutrals. It doesn't matter who we trade with. And this all, of course, ends with the impressment of American soldiers, a cause of the War of 1812, but also the British firing on the HMS Leonard going at the USS, what was it? Someone's got it, not me. But they go after it, and they burn it right in the sights of Washington. And, of course, this antagonizes America, puts up in flames. There's been an attack on an American ship where everyone can see it. And so Quincy Adams says, of course I'm supporting the president, who happens to be Thomas Jefferson at this point. No one in New England does, right? Because we can't, the thought is, if we're New England and our entire industry is based on commerce and shipping commerce, and New England is dependent upon Great Britain, why would you antagonize them? And quickly, they realize that they've been in the political wrong. He's probably been in the political right. But Adams, as with always, goes one step further. And the Embargo Act that Jefferson writes, right, we're going to embargo, he actually pulls Quincy Adams in to help draft that language in the first place. Finally, let me jump forward a little bit. That's, I think, where he begins to shift. By the way, Abigail comes back into the mix. She writes him a letter saying, I can't believe you're a slimy politician. And you have voted for the party that kicked your father out of office. And he writes right back, and he says, Mom, you raised me to be an independent and thoughtful and patriotic individual. That's exactly what I was doing. And she says, oh, good job. By the way, his father supports him in crossing the aisle at this point. And then to leap forward, though, a little bit, he's a national Republican because following the War of 1812, I've sketched kind of broadly where New England is not in line with a lot of what the country is seeing in the run-up to the War of 1812. Do you vaguely remember the Hartford Convention? Right? This is where the Federalist Party shoots itself in the head forevermore. Otherwise known as the Federalist Party doesn't like being at war with Great Britain because it's mainly based in New England, and they hold a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, and vote to secede from the nation. And Adams says, Absolutely not. They're as dangerous up there as what we will later see in the South. So he runs as a national Republican at this point. And by the way, by the time you get to the elections of 1816, 1820, there are Federalists, but good luck getting any of them to self-identify. There's basically only one party by the time that Quincy Adams runs for president at this time. Sir?
Would he qualify as being politically correct?
Never. John Quincy Adams, basically everything out of it. So if you're an Adams, let me frame this a little bit better because it applies to his father. If you're an Adams, you're the smartest person in the room. You have the longest term vision, and you are so annoying that no one listens to you after the first 5 minutes. And so Adamses are really interesting that most of the policies that they advocate are the ones that the United States ends up adopting as very favorable to their national interests. But both John and John Quincy spend most of their political career chasing after those own policies and saying, wait a second, you're misapplying what I said. That's not exactly what I told you to do, and wait, why aren't you listening to me anymore? So politically correct, though, right, that's a modern term that we use. And so politically correct in terms of speaking about things that we find acceptable to the national discourse and using acceptable language, absolutely not. I mean, I gave you the gag rule up there. Slavery is really seen as an issue that is so volatile after the Missouri debates in 1820, where he is Secretary of State, that it will rip the nation apart if it is talked about again. And you know, he's a politician. He's not simply a prophet and a visionary. So when he's running for the presidency, he does not talk about slavery, right? I mean, you're not just going to be president of New England. When he becomes president, in his inaugural address, I told you that on his first annual message to Congress, he talks about improvement, improvement, improvement. That's not his first speech as president. His first speech as president is his inaugural address. And the only word that I think you will find in that address is James Monroe, James Monroe, and James Monroe, otherwise known as a very popular president. Think of me like him. I'm just going to be a legacy president. By the way, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, he was from the South. I won't touch slavery. And yet, 9 months later, he starts talking about improvement, not talking about the potential abolition of slavery, but if you were a Southerner hearing these words, an empowered federal government has powers that you are very worried about, because a very powerful federal government might be able to abolish slavery. So the way, I mean, politically correct, he's never politically correct, but probably the most volatile way that he's not politically correct is by constantly dealing with and nudging towards slavery, particularly during his congressional career afterwards. Other questions? Sir?
Throughout the talk, the two visions of America, the federal government, Quincy's vision, and then, of course, Jefferson's notions of very diverse states' rights as paramount and so forth. We can talk about that in terms of our current, we're still arguing about that.
I will, but let me start by firmly rooting you and me in the 19th century, where my expertise is. So Jefferson's vision of the government is Jefferson's vision of the federal government until it is not Jefferson's vision of the federal government. And by that I mean Jefferson, of course, is the head of a party and an ideology that talks about state sovereignty, not a lot of central control, a weak executive, right? A foreign policy that is unengaged with the world. And yet when Thomas Jefferson himself is president, it's the most massive expansion of executive authority that's happened up to that point. The Louisiana Purchase being first and foremost example. Also, his policies that he's advocated, we don't need a strong military establishment because that's dangerous, right? That's the European model. So the state militia, right, that will work. And by the way, the Navy that Jefferson advocates in theory is one that any schmo off the street can figure out, right? Shallow bottom boats that everyone will hop into and will just attack whoever comes at us. That doesn't play particularly well during the War of 1812. The embargo is not a particularly effective policy. So Jefferson finds himself, I mean, it's really kind of interesting, the reevaluation of Jefferson's own thoughts that Jefferson has, including he writes to his successor, his good friend James Madison, as we are in the run-up to the War of 1812. I can't think of any government so as unready for a major conflict with Great Britain as ours. Of course, he's the president that set the stage for that. So on the one sense, it depends which Thomas Jefferson we're defining. Are we talking the theoretical Jefferson or the Jefferson in practice? Now, in terms of state sovereignty is an issue I talked about briefly when I was talking about how the United States federal government is going to deal with the issue of slavery itself. When he is a congressman, repeatedly, his speeches are really fascinating. I'm not a legal historian, but I really recommend a close reading by anyone interested on Chapter 5 of my book, because he makes legal arguments based on where sovereignty is actually located. It's a historical and a legal interpretation of the locus of sovereignty in American politics. And what he says is that, look, we've actually tried a decentralized system. That was the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, A, worked horribly. It's the reason why we had to have a constitutional convention. But B, the Articles of Confederation were an adaptation after the Declaration of Independence, which located sovereignty in the people writ large, which means not in individual states, but the American people, which can now only manifestly be taken on in the federal government. So that's that. In terms of contemporaneously in American politics, where Quincy Adams would stand, I don't know. And I would caution people to be wary when they think that any particular founding father, or founding son in our case here, advocates for a particular position in contemporary politics, right? I mean, anyone can quote, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, which is generally taken as the kernel of, right, we should not intervene in other countries' politics, which means we should not project our power abroad. That's not the real John Quincy Adams. That's an excerpted line from one of his speeches. The next year, he is advocating for us using force in Florida to forcibly take Florida away from the Spanish for ourselves. So time and circumstances dictate a lot of things, and I would just be cautious about kind of using him as a standard bearer for the contemporary Republican or Democratic Party, although if we're on safe ground in one space, the federal government, the federal government, the federal government. He is not a states' rights kind of guy. He thinks it is a dangerous place to go. And this is what he is. He thinks that also only the federal government can coordinate national products well, as opposed to decentralized states. By the way, he's defeated on that idea, right, by Andrew Jackson, who is his successor. But that's a broad answer, I think, for that question. Any other, or I should say, final questions? Sir.
If you would comment a little bit. When John Quincy Adams was a kid, he was astoundingly well educated. I'm sure that was a result of his association with his father and other things. But what struck me about, and this is from a Collins book about John Adams, yeah. What struck me was that this was the luckiest kid in the world. I mean, he had all this stuff poured into him, and he absorbed every bit of it. He must have been brilliant.
He was. He was absolutely brilliant. I mean, he spoke 7 languages to start. I didn't say that too glibly, although I said it glibly, that he was also a wine expert, by the way. I mean, there's this great moment when he's educated in everything, is what I'm trying to say, where he does a blind taste test of 12 different wines and can guess them and their vintage within 2 years each. The man literally, he's a great enthusiast of gardening, and in fact calls all U.S. diplomats to send home samples, and spends half of his presidency, actually I take that back, spends 9/10 of his presidency, because he's so bad at the politics of it, planting new trees on the way. He knows something, and actually more than something, about everything. The most famous one, which you might recall, is that when he's Secretary of State, that's a pretty busy job, right? And you don't have too many people back in the day to do it for you. In fact, in his opening days as Secretary of State, he is going to meet with the Swedish representative to talk about the terms of their ongoing treaty with the U.S. and whether or not they're going to renew it. And he can't find the treaty anywhere in the State Department. So things are rather disorganized, right? And he starts trying to and attempting to organize everything. And he really, on top of that, right, so he's busy, he's told by Congress that he personally needs to write a report on weights and measures, right? Are we going to have a standardized metric system? He takes this as a scholarly charge to himself, starts waking up at 5 a.m., that's not early enough, 4 a.m., that's not early enough, 3:30 a.m., that's about right, and writes a 200-plus page report that actually is still seen as a standard, really, of how to blend kind of scientific and scholarly endeavor in this field. So you're right. He knows something about everything. Whether or not he's the luckiest person in the world, though, I might give us pause to think about a little bit. Because one of the things that I didn't talk about too much is, I've talked about the incredible pressure that's brought to bear on him. If you're an Adams, I don't mean John Quincy Adams, if you're an Adams, one of two things happen. Before I proceed to tell you them, do we have any Adamses in the audience? This has happened to me twice before on talks, so I have to ask. Okay, well, even if you were here in Adams, I'd say that one of two things happen. You become President of the United States of America, or you drink yourself to death by the age of 35. This happens to John Adams's generation. This happens to John Quincy's two younger brothers. And in fact, one thing which I didn't talk about is as he is leaving the White House, as he's leaving the presidency, he's pretty depressed that Andrew Jackson has defeated him. He gets news that his eldest son has committed suicide. Although his youngest son then goes on to be American ambassador to Britain during the American Civil War and keeps England from recognizing the Confederacy. So lucky, I don't know, because an extraordinary record of accomplishment, but an extraordinarily difficult and challenging life. And in the book I explore in a couple different instances, he's very much like Lincoln in this way. You could think of them as about as different backgrounds as you could possibly have. You can think about the educational opportunities about as differently as is possible to imagine between a Lincoln and an Adams. And yet, both of them are hounded by personal depression. And at multiple instances of Adams's life, he almost loses the ability to function himself. This happens as a young man. This happens during his presidency. He actually falls into not a funk, but a Great Depression itself. So well-educated, yes. Lucky, accomplished, yes. Lucky, from our point of view, yes. From his, I'm not quite so sure. So with that, let me thank you all so much for coming out and spending your noontime hour with me.